couple of minutes to settle, and then I'll kickstart the conversation. Just a few minutes for everyone to just join our webinar. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our guests and audience from New York at the UN General Assembly, from Doha, from Washington, D.C., from the United Kingdom, all around the world. Thank you again for joining us this Tuesday for our fourth and final edition of our UNGA forums. It's been a pleasure being your host for the past 4 days, and such a pleasure interacting live with our audience from around the world. Thank you for sticking with us this entire time. For those that are new today, my name is Anna Rold, and I am the CEO and publisher of Diplomatic Courier. As I just mentioned, today is the fourth edition of a series of forums that Qatar Foundation, in collaboration with the permanent mission of the state of Qatar to the UN and Diplomatic Courier, are hosting in support of UN Global Goals Week. So some quick housekeeping items as usual. The sessions from the past 3 days, as well as today's session, are all available on Qatar Foundation social media channels. And just like in the past 3 sessions, you can join this webinar live from Zoom, where as a registered participant, you can interact directly with our moderators and our hosts and our speakers. Or you can join us live on live stream on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And we will also be interacting with you there as well. So pose your questions that you have to our speakers there. It's now common knowledge that the UN that was established after World War II is trying to reform to meet the challenges of today, challenges that transcend sovereign borders and require solutions that will come from everyone, business, technology, civil society, and global citizens from every corner of the world. They will also require an interdisciplinary approach. And that's why we picked sustainability and education together and not as disparate topics for this year's overarching theme intentionally, because we believe we will be able to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals when we take this inclusive, intersectional approach to problem solving. So wherever you're joining us from, we would love to know who you are and how we may be able to answer your questions. And also let us know how you're working towards solving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker for the morning, Rosie Clayton, who is a World Innovation Summit on Education Fellow and co-founder of Weaving Lab. Thank you, Rosie, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's great to be here today and be with you all, and to have been invited to give some opening remarks in our conversation about the role of digital credentialing and kind of innovation in education and assessment. And I thought I'd open just with some kind of thoughts and reflections on trends we're seeing globally that are informing ways that we think about the recognition of learning and the evidencing of learning and skills, and how we can make that more equitable for more people. Firstly, I think we're increasingly seeing now that breadth of learning and learning that takes place in different forms and contexts should be both recognised and valued. You know, that's education that takes place in formal education settings, but also in informal settings through non-formal learning in the workplace. And, you know, that needs to be recognised and diversified. Alongside that, I would say breadth of strengths is also coming to the fore. So many of our education systems sort of reify academic knowledge, but we're seeing a shifting towards the importance of values on different types of skills and attitudes and attributes that are important for work and also for success in life. That's really important. In terms of, I suppose, credentialing, we're also seeing shifts in terms of the diversity of providers that are now recognising learning in different ways. So traditionally, you would have maybe had, exam bodies or jurisdictions that primarily took a role in credentialing. Now we're seeing, springing up from different types of places. So employers and consortia and other types of providers, giving their kind of stamp to validating, I suppose, different forms of learning. And in relation to that also, we're moving from just numbers as a way of explaining what we can do to a narrative about who we are and how we can tell the story of our learning. We're more than a score at the end of the day. And that really relates to a kind of a broader shift around increasing sort of personalisation in learning, and that need for learning to build our agency and for us to be able to create our own pathways in different ways. I suppose assessment for learning rather than just assessment of learning in and of itself. So for me, that's the sort of broader context within which I think micro-credentials is quite an exciting sort of innovation. I think now there's something like 42 million open badges, micro-credentials that have been issued and are sort of circulating in that sort of skills economy. I think a lot of employers are taking this on board quite a lot in terms of both workforce development and for recruitment. And then also in the informal sector, we're seeing, like I said, that broader recognition, but there's sort of a bridging role to be done in terms of interactions with formal education as well. And it's been great over the last year for me to have been a research fellow with WISE and have undertaken a research project looking specifically at the development of skills ecosystems in Qatar and what we're calling learning ecosystems. And through the research, there was definitely an appetite amongst all the stakeholders that we spoke to for that broader recognition of learning and for them to start experimenting with digital credentialing and thinking about the portability of credentials between different institutions. And I think it's an ambition of the Qatar Foundation now to develop a sort of a skills passport that can be used between sort of higher education, schools, employers and the informal learning sector to bring kind of greater alignment and to more easily recognise some of those more intangible skills and attributes that traditional systems don't necessarily recognise. I think from what does this mean, I suppose, from a learner's perspective? So, if I was, a learner in a particular locality, I could potentially undertake numerous different forms of learning experiences in school, in museums and art galleries, and gain a credential that I could build up into different pathways and to create that story of my skills and my capabilities. And we're also, I suppose, related to that, seeing the development of new forms of, I suppose, learner profiles and learner credentials that bring together different forms of micro-credentials, which is quite interesting. So, how do we reinvent the CV, I suppose, to demonstrate this broader range of skills in a way that's stackable? I think from just my final remarks really, in terms of the technology that sits behind all of this, I think there's a few kind of developments that have really kind of could potentially lead to the acceleration of digital credentials. One is the sort of interoperability between different technology systems that would allow, say, open badges to become more portable between different providers, throughout a learner's lifelong learning journey. And then there's also the integrations aspect. So on a project I worked on a couple of years ago where we were developing local sort of decentralized open badge systems in cities, we started to see integrations with, for example, job recruitment platforms, HR providers and MZ sort of skills data as well. So I think that's quite important from a tech perspective, enabling that interoperability and that integration between different platforms. So the tech's there and sort of poised to accelerate this, I think. But yeah, for my final thought, really, learner agency and creating greater alignment between different organisations, I think is a real opportunity here in terms of micro credentials.
Rosie, thank you so much. You've given us so much food for thought. I wanted to take a quick moment before we dive into the whole conversation and introduce just the panel. And today with us, we have Kelly Ryan Bailey, the Global Skills Evangelist at MZ Burning Glass, Matthew Gee, the co-founder and CEO of Bright Hive, Philip Long, LER Community Manager at T3 Innovation Network, and Philip has a very long concurrent resume as well, beyond his role at T3 Innovation. Rosie Clayton, that we just heard from, Brandon Bastide, Global Head of Learn Work Innovation at Kaplan. And I'm going to dive right into our conversation because Rosie, it was fascinating to me that you said 40 million badges have already been issued. And you gave us such an interesting perspective from the learner's perspective. And I'm very curious to bring Brandon in here, who is at the intersection of the workforce and the higher education world. And he's sort of been a futurist I've followed for over a decade now. I'd love to kind of get a bit of what does the landscape really look like? What are these interactions look like between higher ed and workforce when it comes to credentialing?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Maybe I'll start with a couple broad points that I think are important kind of level setters for the conversation, and then I'll kind of narrow it a little bit more into this alternative credentialing topic that we're focused on. You know, one, we all know, and we've seen it in various different forms, right, that there's a lot of evidence, different kinds of evidence, that we have a massive skills gap. If you take fresh data in the United States, we have 10 million open jobs in the United States, only 8 million people looking for work. There's a lot of factors in there, right? We're starting to learn that, oh, surprise, people actually have preferences in terms of what kind of work they do. And when they're given more choices, the great resignation is taking place, et cetera. But there's obviously a big gap between some of the jobs that are open and the skills that people don't have to fill those jobs. That said, put it aside for a second. One of the big issues we have with our higher education system is that there are really significant doubts about the work readiness of graduates. And this comes from a number of surveys during my time when I was at Gallup before I came to Kaplan. But simple examples, only about 13% of the US population strongly agrees that college graduates are well prepared for the workplace. Only 11% of C-level business executives strongly agree to a similar statement. So there's a real doubt about the work readiness, even among the students that we're producing out of our, illustrious higher education system. And if you say, okay, what is it that these employers are looking for? Yes, they value what I'll call the broadly educated student, but they're also looking for a specifically skilled student. They want both. This is not an either or. And I think we have put ourselves into a dangerous trap by many times talking about alternative credentials or degrees. And where I see a lot of promise is to say, okay, look, that might be a divergent pathway for a lot of learners, but there's also the both and context that we need to bring here. The employers want both broadly educated graduates and specifically skilled ones. So where does this take us in terms of credentials? So first, I'll talk about some of the promising data that hopefully will get all of our gears in full swing of motion. Recent data actually out today in Inside Higher Ed, a survey of 2,000 college students, part of a project that Kaplan sponsors for Inside Higher Ed. But interestingly enough, when students were asked whether their college or university provides alternative credentials, only 14% say that their university does. However, when asked would they like to achieve an alternative credential, 72% of all college students say yes, they would. So there is a significant demand for alternative credentials among those who are in the middle of seeking degrees, yet very few higher ed institutions are offering these things. And then I'll just double click on the value of this to graduates. This was market research that we did a couple of years ago, but when asked of hiring managers of the following graduates, which would they be most likely to hire knowing nothing else? The choices were a graduate with a bachelor's degree in English, a bachelor's degree in cybersecurity, and the third option was a bachelor's degree in English with a designation in cybersecurity. Interestingly enough, they chose the English major with the cybersecurity designation 4 times over the English major alone, and 3 times over the cybersecurity bachelor's degree holder alone. which I think really, double clicks on my point about they want both the broadly educated and specifically skilled. Here's my warning though, as we segue into this conversation. There was a report this year that there are now nearly 1 million unique credentials available in the United States. And that is the broad swath of badges, university certificates, and then industry recognized credentials that are in there. My worry, right, is that of those nearly million credentials that are out there, my estimate is that 0.001% of them have evidence currently that they move the needle economically for the person who completes them. So this is not me putting, a big dampening on the credentialing alternative badge movement, not at all. But I think one of the things we really need to demand in this is to help students find those proverbial needles in the haystack of the credentials that really move the needle for them in their careers, right? They're looking for promotions, new jobs, right? Raises, those are the goals of the folks that are pursuing these. And my worry right now is that it's a confusing smorgasbord of things available. A lot of students could be wasting time. And so that's my only kind of warning as we enthusiastically embrace the alternative credentialing world.
Well, Brandon, you make such an interesting point in defense of broad or general education, that it's not an either or situation, where we should be pursuing both. And also painting a picture of the situation of the global skills gap that we're seeing right now, this paradox that we have jobs available, but not the right skills to match the jobs that are available. So let us get back a little bit to actually explaining what this whole universe looks like. I want to bring in Phil here to talk a little. I'm a Luddite myself. How do you explain what LER really is? These learning, employment, badges, recognition systems. Give us a bit, talk to me like I'm a third grader and I need to really understand this in that way.
I think that level of clarity would be useful across the board. So the learning and employment record is the subset of a form of credentials that recognize achievements and skills that are digitally linked to an individual and that are tamper evident. That is to say, you can prove that whatever has been awarded to an individual is in fact that which the individual is claiming in that credential, and that is done through a nicely developed recent set of cryptographic tools. It's important to do that because it distinguishes the creative writing, which frequently is a part of the traditional narrative resume, from the evidence-based claims of what the person has earned and the skills that have been acquired in that process. So LER is in effect a subset of credentials, because credentials can also be for a whole range of things. And one of the things Brandon mentioned, which I think is important to recognize, is that we think of it in terms of educational institutions primarily, or training companies. But we are learning constantly. We are learning on the job. We are learning in our community activities. We are learning throughout the course of our life. And we need to think of a way, as Brandon noted, to allow for those things that are learned in any of those venues to be recognized, to be validated and endorsed in a way that can be assessed credibly, and to allow for a cyclical reentry into formal education where that's necessary, and back into the workforce or community or government or wherever one is actually engaging in real life in that fluid process. We are really, really bad at those boundaries.
So thank you for that primer, and that's very, very interesting. So up until this point, CVs or resumes include things like, these are the things I have learned besides my formal degrees and my work experience. I also know how to use Microsoft Word, and I also do cycling and biking, and here are my hobbies and everything. What is the difference between a learning employment record and a CV or a resume? Do you need both? One is certifiable, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, the reality is, I think we're in the process of merging those. I sit on an HR open standards group, which actually meets later this morning. It is formed around what is the digital resume of the future. And it is basically looking at how do we incorporate these evidence-based attributes, badges, certificates, and the like, that are individually verifiable into a set that the individual learner earner creates, and then adds the narrative glue to tell the story the individual wishes to tell about themselves and contextualize it. We need both of those things. We don't want to simply give a list of stuff that you click on and say, yes, that was issued by so-and-so, I guess that's true. We want to give the individual person the chance to tell their story and to and illustrate it with evidence that they can claim as theirs, and which everyone who looks at it can do a verification that says, yes, that's actually true. The thing that's really interesting is that for the first time in our work and education space, we have the opportunity to give a credential to a person and have them curate it and rearrange it with other credentials and such, and send it on and be able to trust that the things asserted by those credentials haven't been modified or otherwise manipulated in that process during the time they have held them. The person has never been a trusted party in the relationship between education, employment, and the person has been outside of that. So in the past, I had to ask my education institution, please send me to this location over here, my transcript or my certificates or whatever, and then I wait. I have no idea when it's going to get done. I don't know exactly who they sent it to. I don't know anything. Now I can send it, and what I send is every bit as official and verifiable as what an institution would have sent on my behalf. And that's novel and extremely valuable to empower the person.
I would love to talk a little bit more about that with the panel, because I know everyone on this panel can actually speak to the verification and portability and of this process. But let's dial back a little bit. I want to maybe go back to Brandon real quick, because you mentioned that we have not arrived there yet, where we need to figure out why this is good, to prove why this is good for the learner. I resist saying student, because we're talking about lifelong learners, and what this is going to benefit as a system is the lifelong learner, not just the student. So in your perspective, Brandon, we're not there yet. What would it take to get there? What do we need to do in order to be able to make this valuable for the learner?
Yeah, so look, there's certainly promising signs, right? We're having more conversations than ever about the importance of skills in general, right? And we use a lot of different terminology: upskilling, reskilling, lifelong learning, right? And they might have some, important nuanced differences as we use that terminology, but there's a couple promising things happening, right? As part of the broader education benefits movement among large employers in the United States. These are employers who are now very actively promoting and wanting to enroll mostly their frontline employees, but employees across the board, into both degree-seeking and non-degree skills processes. And it's both for the benefit of their own promotion and opportunities within that company. But interestingly enough, and those of you following the Amazon career choice news know that Amazon is intent on skilling their frontline workers so that they can get jobs elsewhere. And they're making that a very, overt goal of what they're trying to do, right? Come work at Amazon for a while, and we'll help you find your next awesome job elsewhere, right? So you have a movement among employers realizing that lifelong learning is going to be a critical attribute to their success, not just for their own financial performance as a company, but to attract workers at a time when it might be the most difficult labor market that we have ever seen in US history. And certainly, globally, there's variations, but you could argue a very tight labor market in a lot of places. And then on the other side of things, you have K-12 institutions and universities who are increasingly thinking about their role as providing education that's non-degree or non-accredited, right? And so, yes, they're looking to third parties to partner with. They are doing some of this themselves in the form of their own certificates. There is increasing, I think, acceptance from faculty with these ideas, where faculty are starting to understand that this is not a threat to their core role, but something that can enhance students. So the issue is we're just not moving fast enough, right? And we also are not moving in swift ways with a lot of the state and federal regulatory measures that might either help or hurt some of this. So the real question is, right, how fast can we move? How quickly can we scale these kinds of things? But I'll tell you, you look at, just promising examples, Google IT certificates, right? Amazon Web Services type certificates. IBM, long been in the business of offering various certificates. Facebook now, offering certificates, right? You've got a big movement where people getting these certificates can get a well-paid job. And the Google IT certificates, this is just a final point I'll make. When they announced those, they came out and very specifically said, we are going to treat the completers of these certificates as the same as bachelor degree holders and our job, qualification process. That is a huge statement from one of the most admired employer brands in the world. And so these are great indicators of momentum. It's not necessarily a widespread movement just yet.
I'm glad you're bringing up the employer perspective in all of this. Kelly, I want to bring you into this discussion a little bit, being at MZ Burning Glass. How does this benefit the employer, being able to have these kinds of credentials verified and skills badging and, being able to have that portability?
Well, the quick answer to that question is that it saves them a lot of time and money because, early in my career, I actually worked for a subsidiary of Marsh McLennan, and I worked on what happened in the hiring process when you need to verify someone. And that process was actually quite intensive. I know for a fact, even today, there's background checks. There's, as Phil mentioned earlier, sending out to know if these transcripts or certificates are real. There's a lot of checking that has to go. And in a process, especially in a process like today, Brandon mentioned this very tight labor market, any time that is added to the hiring process is not only detrimental to that employer, but it's also detrimental to that employee. I mean, on the plus side, this is an employee marketplace. So that means that in most cases, if that process is going to take 6 weeks, they may have already found another job. And so that's like the easy answer to the question. There's a lot more under the layers of the onion of this conversation, but the easy answer is that it really truly saves time and money.
So no longer are you the employer who has a job description out there calling for applicants, looking at 300, sifting through 300 resumes, trying to figure out who your best candidate would be. How does this process change now with the credentialing opportunity?
Well, I think this is still early times, right? Because the idea being, Phil had talked a little bit about, CV resume versus, these learning employment records. I don't think we're not yet at the place where these are all accepted and, actually in the hiring process with the majority of employers, although there's plenty of movement in making this happen. And I would take a bet that it's definitely less than 5 years until we start seeing employers really start to utilize this more and more often. But right now it's still very traditional process in that in most cases, unless you know someone, you are submitting a CV or a resume into an applicant tracking system. Someone in HR is first the system, obviously, that AI is filtering out that by very traditional methods, not necessarily using the latest and greatest AI that's out there, although it's better than it was 10 years ago, right? There's still some interest in looking at skills. There's still some interest in looking at things beyond a job title or a degree, but it's in the whole scheme of things, what we're talking about here right now and today is not actually being used at scale.
I see. And so maybe this is a great time to bring Matt into the conversation. I would love to start talking about real world examples. And I know, Matt, from your work at Bright Hive in collaborations with partners like World Bank, you can tell us of some concrete examples, especially in the Global South, where you're starting to work on how to implement this in the real world.
Sure, yeah. So it's a pleasure to be on this panel. I think one of the top line messages I'm hoping folks walk away with is that digital credentialing, the things we're talking about, skills-based practices, et cetera, aren't just for kind of the most advanced institutions, or that you have to be really far along in your own digital maturity in order to get started. I think we've had the privilege of seeing, observing, and in some cases participating in initiatives where folks are getting started all along the digital maturity spectrum, from the most mature and advanced institutions. If you look at, you can Google openskillsnetwork.org, and you've got a bunch of institutions that are doing some really innovative work. Also, the network that Phil mentioned, the T3 Innovation Network, there's actually a catalog there of organizations and networks that are deploying digital credentials, like Southern New Hampshire University, right, one of the largest online, in-person and online universities in the US, is using these digital credentials to automate how that institution gives credit for learning that's happened someplace else. Right, be able to, whether that be another post-secondary institution or actually in work or in less formal settings. But that kind of tip of the spear type implementations of these are not the only places where you're starting to see the principles of digital credentials implemented. And I think a case we've seen recently that's just getting started but is really promising is it's actually in Haiti, right? A country that has had a number of struggles in recent years due to natural disasters and other large events. A team there is taking initial steps to establish kind of the foundation of digital credentialing, starting in textiles, just by thoughtfully building on an international labor reporting requirement. And I think that's one of the most important themes I've seen across institutions trying this out, is they look at the digital transformation initiatives they have underway, and they say, how might we, in the context of this thing that we're already going to be doing, right? How might we use some of these principles, some of these standards, some of these newer technologies to make that just a little bit easier, but in the process, unlock the value for the learner and the worker as well, and not just for the government agency or the institution. And I think that starting point, that mindset, can be applied across the whole spectrum of organizational digital maturities.
So I find that very interesting, Matt, that you mentioned that it is a spectrum, that it's not necessarily, all of us all around the world, no matter where we are in our technological or digital advancement, we go straight from cell phone or mobile phone to AI integrated systems. So Rosie, do you feel that's been your experience from the work you've done around the world as well?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, we've had a kind of an experiment, haven't we, in the last year in terms of the pandemic, of, I guess, everyone operating online much more. There's been an increase in, I guess, teachers and students and others, sort of digital fluency and perhaps openness to trying out sort of new types of technology. I think one of the biggest benefits I've found from developing open badges and then systems has been the creation of that sort of common language and common standards between different types of organizations, whether that's employers, schools, higher educators. So, you're almost, defining, say, a specific skill, you're setting, a kind of quality standard that sits behind it. And as other colleagues have mentioned, the sort of verifiable data as well that then is recognised between different institutions. So I think that the process of creating badges and then sort of issuing them and then kind of learners then talking about their learning, communicating that to a wider audience is often as valuable as the end product.
So I have a question for everyone in the panel and whoever wants to jump first. I am a institute or a small organization in any part of the world, especially a part of the world where digitalization is not as advanced. And I have some interesting courses that advance a particular skill for students and learners. How would I as an education provider that may not necessarily be in the formal education sector per se, go about achieving and creating a credential system that is portable, that is safe, that is, you know, secure? Is that something that anybody can do right now as a provider?
Well, I'll start off. And the answer, I think, to that is yes, because one of the first things that's inherent in this, and one of the value propositions I think that these structured credentials are starting to reveal, and they've been there in some sense for a while, but we just are getting around to recognizing the potentials there. And that is, look at what your curriculum is doing in terms of the ways in which credentials can richly represent the work that's being undertaken and the kind of activities the student is doing and the evidence that's generated from that activity to demonstrate that achievement. Simply taking the structure of some of those credentials, analyzing them, and then going back to your curriculum and say, how does this map to things that are practically, clearly demonstrable, where the assessment is about those credentials, is communicatable in clear, simple language to the person that's reading it, and that the rubric behind the judgment for making the decision to award it is transparently obvious. Those things, plus a couple examples of the student's actual work. So when you say they got an award or a credential for communications, one of the more generic of all. What exactly does that mean in this particular context? Is that communications as in a PR, public relations person? Is that communications in terms of a technology protocol? What is that? And what things did they do for which that communication, a certificate or award, was merited? Just that alone is a great start, because one of the challenges, I think, and Brandon and others have mentioned it, is the translation of the sort of typical educational process into real world deliverables in a job context is something students are particularly inept at in most cases. Not that they can't do those things, but they've never been given help and the bridge between the more generic skills in academia and that the application of that to managing a warehouse or to keeping the books properly organized in an accounting process. Mm-hmm. Those connecting the dots things can come from just looking at how you fill out a rich credential and what is the experience the student needs to go through to be able to credibly represent that.
It's very interesting. Does anyone else want to add to this this part of the conversation?
So Philip, you bring up a really interesting point around, we talk about verifying the content that somebody's learned, right? You now have kind of shifted into new gear by talking about verifying projects or actual work that they've completed, and that takes us to a whole different level, right? You think too about the richness of an interview in a hiring fashion, right? Where you can say, well, yeah, I've got this particular whatever credential it is, right? But let me tell you about the project I did as a result. And oh, by the way, here it is, right? In whatever form that might be able to be demonstrated. That brings up a whole new world of how do we verify work products, right? Not just content learned. And I think it's a very, very, I think it's going to become an increasingly utilized function by employers, much like I think there's a bright future for having people demonstrate their ability to do these things in AR, VR type modalities, right? In terms of screening people for the job. So, as much as I think there's going to be growth in kind of the content verification, I think we're going to be, employers are going to be ratcheting that up to kind of project-based review or work product review, or thinking about, utilizing what could be high scale, augmented reality type things where they're, I think about this through the lens of Kaplan, right? Where does exam, licensure go in the future? I mean, you can take an exam, or, there's going to be examples where you actually put on an AR VR system and you manipulate some of the things as a nurse in an actual a virtual clinical setting, right? Like, we're not there yet, but that's going to be a whole nother dimension of this that, Philip, I think you you just made, stimulated in the conversation here.
Philip, you really started something. So I'd like to bring in Matt and then Kelly, who both raised their hands to chime in.
Great. Yeah. So I'll be quick on this because I always like to hear from Kelly more than I like to hear my own voice. You got to listen to her podcast. It's amazing. So the one thing I would say is everyone who's thinking about this, that's listening in, is also able to learn from some of the early failures of digital credentials. And I think one theme there, if you're considering, is this a good fit for me? Is my institution ready? Is to not have it be a technology-driven initiative. We saw a lot of early digital credentialing initiatives that were just excited about blockchain and said, we'll figure out what problems it solves later at my institution. And those almost universally failed. If it was like, let's figure out a fit for a cool technology. So anchor it in one of the business problems that you've heard the other panelists talk about, whether that be transfer credit or speeding up hiring, or have that anchored to a business performance indicator for your organization, for your network, for your government, and have the technology just be in support of that. Have digital credentialing be in support of that business need. And if that's the anchor, then you'll make better technology choices, and you'll be able to see whether or not it's actually helping. And so that's the one piece of advice there.
It's actually incredible advice, Matt, because founders, sometimes we find themselves so caught up in the actual what the technology does, the magic behind it, and not what it solves. The technology is just the tool set, right? So I think that's fascinating. And I'm going to go back to the discussion of the actual technologies, because we talked a bit about the spectrum. But I want to give the forum to Kelly and then to Rosie, who both have some comments.
Well, I actually was going to jump off of the technology piece on this, because I do also think it's great to point out that there are, the actual ability for, credentials to be verified is one thing, right? But the technology, building out a technology is quite an endeavor. And there are plenty of partners out there that have technology platforms that are either open source or usable in some various way. The concept of what we have been talking about, this interoperable piece, think of lifelong learning as I need to be able to move in and out of various forms of education and employment wherever I am, meaning that has to cross borders, that has to cross various employers. If I got that cert at IBM, I need Google to accept it. And I need someone out in a different country to accept it. I need to know those things. So I would just say, from a technology perspective, I agree with Matt wholeheartedly. Don't get caught up in the actual tech, build this tech out. There is a lot of tech out there, and you can partner with plenty of them. Happy to name some, but I won't go there. The other piece that I just wanted to quickly say was, we talked a little bit about the communication to employers, and I just want to push on that for one moment. I mentioned earlier about sort of the basics when we talk about LER, learning employment records, digital wallets, whatever. But the basics are, we verify your formal work history, we verify whatever education you have. There's a lot more underneath the surface that is going to be very helpful for communicating to employers. And yes, 100% being able to talk about what you've learned, but also assessing what you've learned. And again, I go back to skills. I've been a big fan of describing your skills and being able to talk about them in context for a very long time. And that is really the language employers speak. And at the end of the day, a CV or a resume does not allow you to tell your full story. And so that is such an important piece that we tend to forget about. We're just like, great, this cert is verified. Wonderful. What does that mean?
Exactly, right? And that, as Brandon mentioned earlier, comes out in the interview, but is there a better way? Which goes back to something else Brandon said, which is they're not either or, they're complementary to each other. Rosie, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, just very quickly picking up back to Matthew's point about understanding what the problem is you're trying to solve, or what the value proposition is. I think one of the most kind of valuable things I've found, particularly working with informal learning providers who are offering an incredible array of products, community programs, and really wanting to understand the value that that's generating and creating, because it's not certificated in a formal way. So working with them through the process of designing the credential, and thinking about how then they can show the impact of that through awarding and then communicating. And similarly thinking about what Kayan said about kind of learners telling their own story, working with a learner to sort of reflect on their knowledge, their skills, their competencies through the development of a digital credential, and give them a language really to translate what they maybe do in school into a more workplace context. So, give them that skills language through which they can then talk about what they can do to an employer and others. I think it's been, very valuable on a sort of human level, I suppose.
And you all alluded to some, that there's resources out there, that there's information, and then there's companies and organizations and open source technologies. And our audience here today, I'd love for them to get something out of this, to get tangible things that they can use, information, networking. And I'll go over a couple of the comments that have come up through our audience. And please remember, this is a message to our audience midway through. You can send us your questions or your comments, and I'll read them and I'll pose them to our speakers. So who wants to take this? I know, Kelly, you were reticent a little bit earlier to actually name drop, and I'm not looking for that, but what are some of the resources out there that are open source, that are, they manage the spectrum of technologies, not necessarily let's go from zero to crypto or from zero to blockchain, but where could people find resources in order to transfer their skills and credentials in the real world?
Yeah, well, I mean, Matt mentioned one earlier, and obviously Phil is working with the T3 Innovation Group. There's a lot of wonderful resources there. The one that I'm working a little bit more closely with is Velocity Network Foundation. And the reason that I really wanted to be involved in that, with that particular movement, because they really were focused on the employer side of this. And often, I've been working sort of at this intersection piece for such a long time now, and we tend to forget that at the end of the day, if employers are not actually utilizing this and it's not actually valuable for them or valuable for our lifelong learners, then it's a great idea. So this has been a group of, I think it's 25 major global employers that came together, said, hey, we're going to build out the tool set. We're going to offer that up open source for anyone that wants to use it. And they have some great pilots out there, some great prototypes and app that is really fantastic. And, the other thing I would say is that there's such wonderful examples that are just, again, available everywhere. Matt mentioned, we did a podcast together actually, where we talked a little bit about some of these examples, Matt. And I think that's a really good point. But I did one with Velocity Network, and we talked a little bit about really deeply how this might work for someone in the workforce. And we talked about a nurse, and we talked about the fact that if I was a nurse and I needed to move to another hospital system, how I would have to have a large set of credentials available to be able to hand off to that employer. And all of that time in between that I mentioned earlier would have been really, really difficult. But so much more, we're seeing that just the credential itself, even in healthcare, is not only enough. And so that's where I think they're really pressing on. And I would suggest going to check out their resources. There's a ton though, so I'll let everyone else jump in and mention some as well.
Yes, please do. I mean, this is a good time to jump in and share. And I see that on our chat here, some of our speakers are sharing links, and I really appreciate that. So jump in. This is a good moment if you have anything to add.
Well, Matt already gave the link to the T3 LER Hub, which is a collection of applications and resources and projects that are piloting out doing exactly the kind of work we're talking about here. It's a little bit dated since we're migrating it over to the link that I gave, which is the T3 Network Hub, because the T3 has expanded into 4 sort of parallel networks, one focused on learning and employment records, one focused on the actual data associated with employment records, a third that's associated with the standards organizations where these things need to get instantiated, and a fourth that is associated with a set of tools and connections for learning competencies and skills so that they can be developed, as Matt was talking about with OSN, but also you've got to be able to find them to be able to use them. And so there is an open source tool that's been built, and it's on that T3 hub, which describes a meta search across multiple, both proprietary and open source skills and competency frameworks, which is being enhanced. So there's tons of work in this progress going on. For those more technically inclined, the open work going on at W3C in their verified credential community group. Again, caution, it is a technical group, but it is extremely open and supportive for people who are interested in learning kind of the background of this. I would also just point out that we talked about the technology, and in the back end is important, but I want to highlight that the technology exists in paper as a hub, as a hybrid environment. You can print out the data that is in a digital credential, a badge, or a certificate, and have it embedded in a QR code on a piece of paper that when scanned can be shown and can be validated just like a digital representation of that same thing. Mm-hmm. So there is remarkable capabilities in terms of, from the technical point of view, compression that allows you to put lots of data into this little funny looking square that kind of looks like someone did a Jackson Pollock painting over the top of it. But that information, when scanned by just a little hand scanner and a mobile device connected to it, can do the connection to whatever network is there behind it and make that individual equal participant in this credentialed world without necessarily having $1,000 smartphone.
Matt, I know you wanted to add to this. I'm glad you mentioned the $1,000 cell phone, because that's one of my next questions, but I want to hear Matt's point of view here too.
I'll just briefly share that I think, one thing to note about a lot of these efforts that have been linked to is that they are pretty US centric. Even the World Wide Web Consortium groups that are meeting, it's pretty US and Euro heavy. And so the one thing I would just point out is that there's enormous opportunities for leadership in regions that are underrepresented in the links that we've got here. And the really interesting is because so many of the technologies are open and the ideas are open, the folks that are helping establish this are just the people that are showing up. And so in addition to just being able to benefit from some of the resources and the links, I would encourage folks who are interested in this to think about the role they might play in leading these types of efforts, these types of networks in their own countries, in their own regions, certainly being part of the international community that's grappling with this, but really playing a leadership role.
And I appreciate that, Matt, actually. I'll take it as an open invitation to everyone here who may not be involved, but that there is leadership opportunities and opportunities to be involved with these networks. For if you're in another country and you want to kind of spearhead and bring solutions to your region. So Rosie, then I guess my next question is to you. What does the landscape look like around the world in terms of are we just talking over here and we're not resonating with parts of the world where, we might, we were talking about it 2 days ago in a previous forum where we can be talking about these amazing technologies and advancements and ideas and consortia. But at the end of the day, the stark reality is 3 billion people around the world don't even have basic access to the internet. So I know Phil mentioned the QR code. One thing that we're seeing more happen now is massive adoption of mobile phones, even if they're in an analog era. We're quickly, getting more adoption around the world. So I'd love to kind of bring you into this conversation, what you've seen through your work.
Yeah, I think as others have alluded to, it's a really mixed picture globally, and the US has kind of been a leader in both developing the thinking, the technology, and the investments in some of the potential solutions. And I think there's a lot of interest in this space. There's a kind of people are kind of exploring it and thinking about how it could apply in their own context. It's quite interesting to see sort of national governments taking this on board as a concept as well. So, for example, in New Zealand, I think they're rolling out micro-credential systems, particularly in vocational educational training. So, it's getting more sort of traction and interest now at a jurisdiction level too. But I think impact is still to be proven, as I think Brandon said earlier. If we can demonstrate that micro-credentials do shift the dial significantly for learners and in bridging the skills gaps, and I think that will kind of spur interest. And I suppose also once maybe technology becomes a little bit more accessible or cheaper. So I know from experience of working with one particular badging platform, the providers that we were working with, which were sort of quite small scale nonprofits as well as sort of medium-sized education institutions, were very wary or kind of had in the back of their mind, what's the portability of these credentials to a different system perhaps in the future if this one ends up being too expensive for us in the longer term. So I think once those sort of connectivity aspects can be sort of ironed out, then I think that might spur greater sort of interest, I suppose. But other colleagues have probably got more experience on the technical side of things.
No, completely understand. I would like to bring in a comment question that came from our LinkedIn group. And it was framed in the sense of credentials versus character. Is it possible to capture ethics and behavior and values as well through digital badges? How would we be able to do that? And in which ways could the technology help to make this more visible than analog credentials? For whoever wants to take this on. Is it, here being the fuzzy of the group, and by fuzzy, I mean, I don't know how the technology really works. I just want it to work for me. So how would we actually make that work in a digital credential world? Could we create digital credentialing for skills or intangible things like values and character and things like that, which are very important to an employer? Matt, you raise your hand.
So one of the, trying to go from low level to high level, one of the really interesting things that Phil did in the last session where he's working on these HR open standards, and it's very low level kind of data structures for these digital credentials for employers, is get that group to include this notion of an endorsement in this digital credential. And it's a pretty general notion of you endorsing me for something, or this organization endorsing me for something. And I could see, it didn't come up in that discussion, but I could see, I know in, our company has a core set of values, and, we can endorse not just for someone doing a great job at on specific tasks in our work, but actually living up to the specific values that we espouse as a company or as an organization. And I could see that being an application of that term, of that ability to endorse. I think would bring all sorts of additional ethical challenges potentially with it, but that could be a start.
Thank you. And Phil, you wanted, and then Kelly, you in that order. Phil, Kelly, please chime in.
Yeah, I appreciate Matt bringing that up, because I think what we're talking about is instantiating the extremely important human connections that we forget about when we often talk about the technology. We tend to talk about it, and it seems to abstract things in a way that takes it away from what really matters. And we all know that, forgetting technology for the moment, that the networks of personal interactions that are networks of trust existed long before technology ever was there. And in some ways, what this notion of endorsement is about is finding a way to bring that back into this environment of the technology by allowing people to express their support for, or their affirmation that somebody has done something of value. And in doing so, also doing it in a context which gives a little bit of individual context of the person that's making that endorsement, that says, well, this person, who is this person? Situate them so I understand why they're making that endorsement. Are they even capable of making the assessment they're claiming? and give me a way to be able to get my hands around this. And so these technologies, in my view, are building effectively a new digital networks of trust that we weren't able to do in the past. And I'll make one other comment, and that is there are, in many of the discussions around some of the actual structures of these credentials, places that are still not well developed yet, where the individual can describe how they would like their own personal data to be used. That's contained in the credential. Literally a section in there that says, well, I would like these things to be remained private and permissioned, in the sense of you need to ask me if you're going to wish to share them with others. And these other things I have no trouble with you sharing in any way you like. And having that travel with the credential, so that the person who receives it can't say, well, I didn't know, I just, it wasn't there. But it actually is there. And that's coupled with, in the new versions of cryptography, the ability to actually engage a dialogue. So when you present a credential, you're not presenting everything like we had to in the past. You're presenting those things you want to share at this moment. And then if the person wants to ask more detailed questions about you, they can do so. And then you can reveal elements of the credential that you had previously kept hidden, so that you can enrich the dialogue. And so in many ways, that's instantiating, again, the human interaction that is so invaluable in a conversational exploration, now mediated by a position of control by the learner or the earner.
And I think that's a pretty fascinating part of the discussion that I want to come right back into, but I want to hear from Kelly first as well, because she had her hand raised.
Oh, thank you. And happy to make it quick, but it actually brought up a question for me back to the group, was that the concept of endorsing is amazing. I love it. I tend to always think from an employer perspective, of course, and I'm like, right, but how, when you're talking about, if you're one huge company and you're hiring millions of people per year, like how do you scale that? And I'm curious if anyone's been working with initiatives that are going that route. I would love to hear.
Quick response, and that is the general sort of domain that you've opened up is this notion that we've been calling scaled profiles, or how do we allow the information that we would like to make available and freely accessible versus the stuff that we would not. How do we have a mechanism that allows for, at scale, the ability to share that with those contexts? I think we're in literally there are working groups that are looking at this at the moment, and it is kind of one of the next challenges. But the questions you asked that was sort of embedded in there is you've got the same problem that was mentioned by at the beginning, with respect to, you've got thousands of credentials and millions of people in contention for positions and the like. How do we get structure around this? Because we just don't have human time to spend on going through all of that. And one of the things is we have to think about meaningful profiles of the representation of our stuff that may follow particular work domains or types of work. So I have a set of things that I reveal based on what I think the employers are looking for in that space, and my particular personal way of wanting to be presented in that space. And simplifying the problem of, I have millions of things to say, you've got millions of questions about me. Where is there a handful of things that we can simplify this process and then allow the conversation to explore? I think Matt has a question.
No, I love that you're helping me so much moderate this panel. Matt, what was your question?
I guess his less of a question is more of a kind of reaction to Kelly's question and Phil's comment. I just want to point out some examples where these types of endorsements happen, but they tend to be more within specific work communities. And to Phil's point, how does that kind of bubble up to? So in kind of the coder community, you have communities like Stack Exchange or even GitHub, where there your participation in that community, your responses to people's questions, and living by certain community norms actually do accrue as little digital badges on that platform for you. Even, in a very crude sense, I know someone's wanting to talk to me about a job whenever I get an endorsement on LinkedIn from them. So each of these different platforms have almost like separate social norms around how endorsements and digital endorsements happen. And I think that kind of wild west of endorsement is where it's all happening now. And the potential hope, for what Phil's talking about is that the sum of those different endorsements in different domains can actually follow you around, or you can choose to share them if you so wish, as long as we avoid the kind of Black Mirror episode of we're rated on every social interaction, and then our overall star rating is what determines everything from social status to our next job.
It's fascinating you both brought this up, because one of the things that's been interesting to me is looking at these platforms like Quora and LinkedIn, right? Quora is an interesting platform where you can get answers to questions, and Quora's algorithm helps you get to the best answers to your question from people who are considered experts and specialists, right? And on LinkedIn, of course, your status is elevated when you're endorsed by other experts on the same field. So that's a slippery slope, obviously, and the question goes back to what you all brought up during this conversation, the question of interoperability. Do these platforms talk to each other? Do these new platforms talk to each other in a way that actually makes sense for the employer? Or are we introducing more complexity to the entire system? I would love to hear from Rosie on this one. Obviously, she's deep in the trenches and actually getting this type of work spearheaded.
Yeah, I was sort of starting to think a little bit about it in terms of the context of that, those different communities. I think it's a fascinating point about, kind of endorsement and kind of the language and the norms sitting within particular communities. And certainly that's often been most effective, like, has been mentioned, sort of, technical or certain industry sectors. They were looking at certain types of credentials, and how do we start to create or transmit that language and those norms between vastly different sectors, and so I've been doing a lot of work thinking about what sort of kind of, I suppose, bridging architecture is needed, what sort of orchestration is needed at the system level to get different sectors and systems talking together and developing that sort of common language and to enable them to think about credentialing. But I think, trying to make sense of all of this from, let's say, if you're an employer or a learner or an education provider is really hard. And, really from say, if you're a hiring manager or an admissions officer for higher education, you need to be able to see a credential and understand its meaning pretty quickly. So, I think that's a challenge as they proliferate, and we're getting different types of technologies around which badges sit and different types of platforms which structure the credentials in different ways.
Thank you. I know Kelly had also an answer to this. Thank you for that, Rosie.
I was just going to jump on what Rosie said about the communication between the various groups. And I just think it's such a valid point here, because, everyone's sort of speaking a different language. And as we've all discussed, sometimes this is also happening in the various countries as well. And I think if we, the work that I've been really trying to focus on is how do we break down the education within the digital credentials or whatever education, right? Like, it doesn't matter if it's a micro cert or a bachelor's degree or a PhD, it doesn't matter. But how do we break that down into skills? And also the same from the work standpoint, because, really at the end of the day, if we can think of ourselves as sort of having this very unique set of skills, that's, I have a very unique set of skills, and although we all are working on the same issue, I guarantee that all of us have our own unique set of skills that we bring to the table. And how do we define that and maybe look at the opportunities or the work that we've done in the past in education, in our formal work history, and also understand that in terms of skills. And, there are a lot of open source resources, some of which are provided by MZ Burning Glass that are helping people break down, or what I say skillify, but break down that educational content and break down that work content so that we can all sort of speak this common language, whether or not that's the exact common language that will connect us in years to come, who knows, right? But at least it's a start and a foundation where we can all at least create that interoperable layer.
And that is such a critical issue, I feel, in this entire discussion, figuring out how that works. I do have one more critical question for all of you. I don't know who wants to take it on first. I was going to go with Matt first, but we'll see. And that is the data portability, data safety. That is such a slippery slope. I know earlier, I think it was Phil that mentioned that Phil or Matt, I think both mentioned the issue of data safety and data security. I want to double click on that a little bit to really understand what it means when you have portable credentials or a credentials passport or a skills passport, and you're moving from country to country or from industry to industry or even from company to company. What does that mean with the new technologies being introduced right now?
Great. So it's a great question. And the unfortunate answer, the unsatisfying answer is that what it means actually varies a lot depending on, who's implementing and what exactly, what principles they've committed to. But I'll just back up and say a little bit, whenever we talk about learner data, student data, especially like our kids' data, in K-12, issues of safety, privacy, ownership, right? They're the forefront of our minds. They're the forefront of everyone's mind. And the big reason for that is that I think we've all seen the real harms that can occur when privacy isn't paramount, when we can't control our own data. And there is this kind of larger global, as a larger global community, we're in the middle of renegotiating our digital social contracts, right? What companies, governments, NGOs, et cetera, can do with our data. The thing that to me is really encouraging is the folks that are showing up to all of those links that we put into chat are coming with that mindset, are coming with a realization that the digital social contract we've operated around with credentialing data and with work data, et cetera, to date has been insufficient. It's been broken. And so many of these groups are coming with a principles first approach, whether it's the IEEE groups or the World Wide Web Consortium group that Phil talked about. They're starting from a place of principles of privacy and individual ownership of data, that nothing can happen with my credential data without my consent, and that I can have full visibility as the owner of that data, regardless of what platform it originates in. As the owner of that data, I can know who's doing what with my data. It turns out that's technically very, very hard to implement and to get broad adoption around. But the fact that those groups and those standards are starting with that principled basis, I think, is really encouraging. And for me, it says, if you're going to be starting a digital credentialing initiative in your country, in your organization, make sure it's rooted in those principles of privacy. Ask the vendor, ask the set of partners that are coming to you, ask the consultancy, what international standards of privacy are they committed to in this deployment? Because while the technology can support those types of the implementation of those principles, privacy first, individual ownership, there's a lot of forces that work against those principles of ownership and privacy first. There's a lot of money in gobbling up all of our credential data and then selling access to that data. And those incentives don't go away just because we use blockchain. The incentives are as strong as ever. So ensuring ownership and privacy isn't just about where if you use blockchain, you're okay. right? It has to be rooted in a set of principles with teeth, and ultimately it will need and require a set of governing policies around this data on a country by country and region by region basis. So that's just a little bit of my, I'll get off the soapbox now and allow other folks to chime in.
Well, that's just fascinating. You know, going back from the fuzzy point of view, right? Being able, this is a real shift in sort of the information economy, going from this world where my data is harnessed and sold and resold for whatever free service I'm getting, right? And shifting to a whole new data economy where the individual, the user, the learner, the student, the educator, the citizen has complete agency, ownership of the data, and decides what part of that data can be sold in the process, so the citizen or the user, the student can make a profit out of it, or what cannot be sold at all and maintain complete privacy. Is that a utopia I'm describing, or is that where we're headed? Who wants to jump in?
Well, I'll just briefly mention that, I mean, I think Matt highlighted something, and I just put it in the chat. The underlying issue that is the elephant in the room is the incentives around that data. Right now, the incentives are completely scaled and stacked in one direction. And that's why that gray market of analytics data is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it's been, because it's never been possible to do it any other way. This isn't that people sat in the back room and came up with this idea 20 years ago and said, boy, we're going to put this in place and move it forward. It was the only way analytics could be aggregated and put together. There was no possibility for an individual to express anything about how they wish to share their data in any kind of useful, meaningful, or implementable way. And so the industry evolved, and that makes, it's understandable. Now we've sort of elevated the participation of individuals who are the originators or about whom those data actually speak to be potentially a voice in this. And so the real critical issue is, what are the new incentives that make it worthwhile for either the individual to be willing to share data in ways that they may have in the past and are potentially still willing to do so now, or make it possible for those who profit from that data to give a piece of it back to the major contributors from whom that profit actually was derived. That is the aggregate data set of individuals that they've built these algorithms from and then which they profit.
And it's a fascinating sort of just seeing the evolution of the market, but also seeing evolution in mindsets. Obviously, legislation and regulation has a big role to play here. I wanted to ask a question. We're getting towards the end of our panel, but there was a question from the audience, and Rosie, Kelly, maybe one of you would like to take this. And the question is, can badges reduce bias in the employment sector? Or anyone who wants to chime in.
I'll let Rosie go ahead first, and then I'm happy to jump in.
No, I was going to say, I think that's an absolutely critical question. To what degree, does that sort of element of anonymity, perhaps, that's all, provided by a badge, actually, help increase equity or kind of restructure the sort of biases that exist? But I don't know if anyone has any concrete data. I don't know what the evidence is that exists around that at the moment.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. I really don't think that we've actually gotten to the point of digging into that a bit more and pulling some information on it, which I think is such an important piece to this, because, the concept, I think, even in the early days when we started talking about the concept of skills-based hiring and learning, and this was before even, the concept of interoperable learning records came around, the idea was, if we could break down and not really focus on sort of old, outdated standards like a certain degree from a certain institution, would that mean that we're opening up the, equality of the situation? And I just don't think we have the information at hand. Although Matt, Phil, I don't know if you know of any that's out there.
The only thing, I was talking with the CEO of a company called Textio, And this is a company that the main thing it does is help companies know the bias in their language that they're using for hiring. And it under the hood, right, they're using machine learning to fight machine learning, right? To fight bias in machine learning in some ways, which is great. And the one thing, it's not concretated, but one thing that said is that, the better data they've got, the better they're able to help employers debias their processes. So I think, digital badges and the kind of richer information that it allows a potential employee to bring to that conversation about hiring and to the algorithms that are being implemented there will make some of those algorithmic platforms trying to fight bias even more effective.
It's been such a rich conversation today. And I would like to maybe just take us all the way back from Earth and into the outer space and ask the very, very big question. What do you think? We're here on our last UN General Assembly Global Weeks Forum for the week. And on the sidelines of the meetings that are happening, the multilateral meetings, where we're discussing achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which, as you all know, Goal 4 and 8 relate directly to the conversation we're having today. Employment opportunities for all, work for all, education for all. And these are lofty goals and targets that we've set a deadline to achieve by 2030. So the question that I have for you today, as we close this forum today, but also the series themselves, is very quickly, if you could wave the magic wand, and I hope that's not a technology magic wand, but it's more of a more comprehensive solution, what would you want to solve first, and how would you do it? And maybe not go into the how, but what is it that we should be tackling right now? And maybe I'll start with Rosie and Kelly and Matt, and then I'll end with you, Phil. Sorry I figured we started with you, we'll end with you.
It's a ginormous question, thank you. For me, thinking about how new technologies can disrupt the sort of linearity of pathways, often that students get tracked into or learners get tracked into throughout their lives. Thinking how can we, broaden access to quality learning experiences, and how can that breadth of recognition that is afforded by things like digital credentials really increase equity and opportunity within our system. But for me, disrupting that linear tracking that often happens through academic or vocational pathways or whatever it might be, for me would be a priority.
Very, very good. I love the idea of constructive disruption. Kelly, you're next.
Thank you. And I love that point too, because it definitely is not all of our tracks are not linear. But if I was to wave my magic wand, I would want, when I think of all learning, I think of what we learn in life experiences. And we have not yet figured out a way to make that understood by employers. I tend to use the example because I'm a mother. And I think that, my experience in being a mother has actually made me stronger professionally. And I think there are a lot of experiences we have throughout our life, challenging moments that create skills that help us practice skills in a much more deeper way than, in some cases, formal education and work experience. And I feel like that should be a huge part of what our future looks like.
Phenomenal. Thank you, Kelly. Matt, you're next.
When I think of, all the global education challenges, I think of a recent report that stated or estimated that 825 million young people will not have the basic literacy, numeracy, and digital skills to compete for jobs to compete for the jobs of 2030. And so I think if I could wave a magic wand, it would actually be to bring Goal 4 and Goal 8 a little bit closer. I've actually never understood why they're numerically separated. That that the education systems globally see and measure their success increasingly on the ability for the young people they're training to have those basic literacy, numeracy, and digital skills to compete for those quality jobs. And I think digital credentials can help with that connection. They can help with the measurement and accountability at the government level, and really make it clearer to students, to parents, and families who are deciding, do I send my kid back to school next year, or do I have them, do this job that will help put food on the table? That it will help communicate the value of that, the marginal value of additional education to help secure those jobs.
You're right. They shouldn't be so far apart. There should be better understanding and collaboration between the education sector and employment and the private sector, or the employers. Phil, 60 seconds.
Okay, well, so I think that digital credentials have a huge role to play in enabling mobility and enabling learner-earner agency and equity. But I think in the face of the current global crisis that the UN Commissioner General mentioned at the beginning of the week around climate change, the real pressure is, how do we integrate interdisciplinary thinking into these credentials so that people can work on the problems that we really have to solve? Because this is going to be moot. We can talk about this until 2030, and in 2030 it'll be 5 or 2.7 degrees warmer in temperature, and we will be dealing with mass migration, mass famines, and the rest of the preceding events before massive extinction, frankly. And I actually am very concerned about that. One of the things we can do is get education to realize that these problems are not in disciplinary boxes. They actually are interrelated, and we need to recognize that in the way in which we teach students, give them opportunity to work even in high school and before in areas that can contribute to the solutions that we need. It's only through those young people around the world that we have a hope, in my view, of making this work to turn this around and actually saving what could be a planetary extinction event. And I truly believe that.
Phil, yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for that conclusion. I want to thank the panel today. It was so wonderful to have you and to have your expertise and to have it communicated so eloquently for topics that are very difficult for me sometimes to grasp, and I appreciate you all today. And I really want to take a second to thank our host, the Qatar Foundation, and our strategic partners, the UN mission of Qatar, the Qatar mission to the United Nations, and of course, all the teams behind the scenes that have worked for several weeks to make this series happen. It's bittersweet to see it end, but it's now, we have one more amazing speaker that will give us some conclusion remarks, and her name is Houria Ahmed. She's the Director of Policy Hub at Qatar Foundation CEO Office, and she will help us adjourn and get more context on today and the last 4 days. Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Anna. And it was wonderful to hear the discussion today from our panelists, and indeed, of course, for the last 4 days, it was very enriching. And also to thank our strategic partners from our side, also the Permanent Mission of Qatar, the Diplomatic Courier, and to our colleagues at WISE and the Qatar Foundation. I agree, it was indeed a team effort. And to really thank our speakers and participants for their incredibly insightful remarks throughout. I hope our audience enjoyed our rich discussion. And I would like to provide you with a brief recap of our sessions held over the last few days and conclude with some final remarks. The kickoff to our panels on day one saw a discussion on education systems and climate action. Our panelists discussed the importance of curriculum development, teacher training, and systems level thinking to cultivate engaged young leaders who are empathetic, compassionate change agents in advancing the sustainability agenda. Day two saw a discussion on new models of impact in education technology, where the discussion highlighted the important role of the private sector investment in educational outcomes that ultimately enable youth to solve for sustainable development challenges and not only rely on governments and the public sector. Day 3, our panelists looked at creativity and sustainability and involving youth in decision-making. And in light of this, we applaud the UN Secretary General's announcement of the creation of a UN Youth Office and a special envoy for the future generations. We're doing our part at Qatar Foundation by making this year's Global Education Convening, the WISE Summit 2021 in Doha, a forum that seeks to bring youth to the decision-making table. And today you've just heard our panelists discuss how skills in society are evolving and trying to find new ways of recognizing such learning, going beyond the traditional credentials and looking at relevant experiences and values and the knowledge that we acquire through our lives. And indeed, this new world of micro badging and skills economy, I think will benefit a new kind of learner, the lifelong learner. So having provided you the summary over the last few years, I'd also like to draw some concluding and emerging thoughts on the importance of education for sustainability. With the climate crisis that we face today, we know that our youth will bear the consequences of our actions. And if they are act as good custodians of our planet, we need to prepare them for their task. Education for sustainability should focus on empowering learners of all ages with the necessary skills, attitudes, and values that will enable them to address complex and interconnected nature of the challenges we face around the globe. Future generations need to be empathetic, active citizens who behave quite differently than we have. While the solution may not only be education, there is no solution to the climate crisis without it. Education must be transformative and build on a set of life values that will empower our youth to address issues within their communities and to create a collective approach across continents. This has been a major area of focus for the Qatar Foundation. We aim to nurture capable, well-rounded, and value-driven human beings through education, science, and innovation, and to cultivate engaged youth capable of that active and local global citizenship and environmental stewardship. Focusing on new ways to educate our youth about sustainability issues, our K-12 network is continuously exploring new and innovative models of curriculum development and active student engagement to ensure that the necessary skills and values, which are rooted in the Islamic teachings of custodianship, are being taught to our students. More broadly, we believe that the foundations, in fact, can and do play a key role in building coalitions between governments, businesses, NGOs, and with wider society. Leveraging the power of global convenings, such as that seen in the last 4 days, are incredibly important to build the coalitions necessary for positive actions towards advancing the Sustainable Development Goals beyond the commitments made by nation states. However, to accelerate change, we must create a mechanism for ecosystem-level collaboration where educators, professionals, schools, students, the private sector, and government can exchange ideas and lessons learned from different trials. As referred to in previous sessions here, government action can't solve this alone and the challenges we face alone. We need those collaborations to profoundly shift the way we approach education so that we fundamentally change the way we interact with our natural environment and move towards our sustainable development goals. And what we have also learned is that the responsibility to teach younger generations does not only sit with educators. Learning opportunities exist wherever the child exists or the individual exists. And for most of that time, that means outside of the classroom. So even if our generation have been poor stewards of our environment, we have a responsibility collectively and individually to set a worthwhile example to the next generation. If we want to advance our global goals, we must seize the opportunity to ensure sustainability is on the agenda everywhere, not only for the direct benefit it entails for our economy and planet, but so that it permeates the very fabric of how we live and organize ourselves as societies. Thank you for tuning in, and see you at our Youth for Climate series in Milan, COP26 in Glasgow, and at WISE 2021 in December in Doha. Thank you very much. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you to all, and wishing you all a great rest of the week at UNGA and beyond. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.